Mike, welcome to the show, and this time we get to do it in person.
I know, mate. I'm excited for it.
And you've just invoiced me from your flight for Southampton because that means this podcast officially made it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I think it's taking it serious now. So.
I'm at a level now where I can fly guests in. Just for the listeners' clarity, that is a joke. So please do keep blasting the show on your stories and sharing it, getting it out there. But some of you will remember Mike from a previous episode back in May 2021, so a long time ago now. And quite a lot has changed since then. So we're gonna have a bit of a refresh while we've got some time together, and you've come north of the border.
Definitely sounds good, mate. I'm up for chat on anything.
And people will know you as the Coffee Shop Copywriter, and obviously you've got copywriting as your main strand of business, and that's been extremely successful over a long period of time now, and that's definitely something I'm interested to talk about. But in particular, since May 2021, what are the kind of main things that you would share as headlines for people who are looking to get up to speed in the world of Mike Samuels?
So I think from a practical standpoint, not a whole lot has changed with the business structure. Without sounding too woo-woo, but from a mindset standpoint, I think things have shifted quite a lot for me. I'm a lot less business focused, a lot less revenue focused, and have been concentrating a bit more on stuff outside the business. So trying to set things up so that actually it's a bit more freedom, a bit more time to do other things, to pursue other activities. And just trying to, as always, be a bit more laid back about it and not overstressed with the business side of things.
Yeah. What do you think you've optimized more for then? Freedom was one of the words that you used there. What else?
Yeah, certainly kind of extra pursuits outside of business. So as you and I have talked about, I've got into my ultra endurance stuff. I've done a few challenges. And so my approach now is very much that's my focus, and then business needs to work around that rather than squeezing in training and that kind of stuff around the work side of things.
Yeah, but even when you were maybe in growth mode with the business, you did have your powerlifting. You've lifted some big numbers. How many times did you compete in that space?
About a dozen or so, I think.
Yeah, so you did take that seriously as well. So you freed up bandwidth from not doing competitive powerlifting to do your endurance stuff, but you've also freed up bandwidth to do the endurance stuff through business as well, through maybe less revenue focus. Would that be a correct summation?
I certainly think that I've always got training in. It's always been a priority for me, but very much sort of the last 18 months or so, I think I've actually done the opposite of a lot of people, and I now see my business more as a job rather than a business. So a lot of people go into it thinking, I don't want this to feel like a job. I want this to feel like it's, my passion, the thing I love to do the most. And I still really enjoy my work, but I've gone back a bit more to thinking of it as it's a job. I'm working for myself. I pay myself a salary. I don't have set hours, but I'm a lot stricter now on, right, I'm going to stop work at this time. I'm going to be very diligent in terms of not overstressing stuff, in terms of making sure that actually everything else comes first. And yeah, for me, having a low stress lifestyle has gone even further up the priority list.
It's like a value set, isn't it? And that's
yeah.
moved up the way. But one of the headlines that I know that you wrote to your email list about, that you've shared quite openly, is that you hit the $500,000 revenue figure for the first time. How did that feel?
It was sort of much for muchness, if I'm honest. And I know that's something we're going to talk about today, and that probably does sound very blasé. And I'm aware that I'm saying that from a very fortunate position. I don't mean to be dismissive of that at all, but one thing I've learned a lot over the last few years is that actually the sort of the numbers on the spreadsheet or the money in the bank account, it's certainly not the be all and end all. And that's not to say that obviously finances are a big thing. I wouldn't be dismissive of that in any way whatsoever, but I certainly buy into that aspect of, I think it's that fairly famous study that talks about something like once you're over $77,000 or $74,000 or something a year, happiness doesn't really increase along with income at all. It basically just plateaus out. And I think I've found that in the real world has been, maybe not that exact number, but it's certainly been fairly true of that, really. So yeah, it was great to hit it. And then much like a lot of achievements, you think, well, that's fine, but actually what's next? Because I find the enjoyment of something is in the process and in the challenge, not necessarily achieving it.
I think a lot of wise people talk about the process and the challenge being the most important part, and obviously the result being an afterthought of that. But of course, one of your values being freedom, that additional revenue probably provides you with more freedom than ever before, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I did the numbers the other day, and it'd always been a goal of mine to get to the stage where I wouldn't have to work for sort of 4 or 5 years and I'd still be okay. and did that and found that actually I basically hit that without kind of necessarily realizing it. Again, from a position of being very fortunate to be like that. But like you said, it was a weight lifted. It's very much, okay, actually, I don't need to stress too much over how things are going now. And I'm willing to admit there's probably some naivety in that. And I know we do need to know our numbers in business, but tying into how I like to do things, it has always been very much more of a creative way of doing things rather than analytical. So for someone who's not overly analytical, who really doesn't like spreadsheets, who doesn't like doing any form of paperwork or admin, to see that was, again, it was a big sort of mindset flip, or it's like that weight was lifted for me to think, actually, I can keep doing what I enjoy, but there's no need to stress over more business growth because that's not going to give me more pleasure in life, really.
One of the things I've always tried to work on as a host is asking the question that the listener might be shouting down their AirPods or their earphones, whatever they're listening to. And I guess if I was to ask a very like layman's or a listener's question would be like, how did you get to a point where you were able to generate such revenue as a one-man band? Obviously your skill as a copywriter has continued to increase. You can demand higher fees. What's been the kind of the things that have moved the dial for the Coffee Shop Copywriter to grow and grow and grow?
I suppose it's been like anything. There's always a number of things, really. Certainly diversification in terms of products and services offered, because when I started out in copy, it was very much, I'll write copy for you. And that was the only thing I did. A bit of critiquing, a bit of coaching, but it was very much scalable and leverageable to the extent of I can raise my rates and I can work more hours. That was basically it. I tried taking on some freelancers, but for me, managing people just wasn't enjoyable. It's not a strength I have. I wasn't willing to work on it. So it was just me writing copy, and you might put your fees up 10% every year. You might work a bit more to get more work done. But I realized with that I hit sort of a certain level. And so two options really. One would have been to go down the mini agency route, hire other writers, maybe bring someone on to do like traffic generation and Facebook ads and that kind of stuff. But just didn't suit me whatsoever. So I went more into the sort of product creation side of things. So I would have had probably the same products when we last spoke, but since then it's kind of snowballed. So I sell a couple of online courses, a monthly print newsletter, have a mentoring group. So it's been those things where, yes, you have to work a bit harder to sell more of them. I don't think the whole idea of, passive income does exist, but it's not a case of you work exactly the same amount whether you've got one person or 1,000 people. There is extra work to do, but it's not proportional necessarily to how many more people you've got buying into that. So I really focused on that in terms of a means of growth. So that would probably be the biggest thing I would say in terms of getting to that level.
Yeah, diversification of revenue streams, but equally as your experience and your skill set's probably increased over time, you become a better copywriter. People are more likely to look to you for that online course, for the templates, for the coaching, for the ability for them to generate the level of freedom which you enjoy as well, albeit maybe on a staggered scale. Because for somebody, it might be hitting 100K revenue is like life-changing, whereas now and this is definitely a topic we want to talk about, the fact that you've had such a high revenue for almost a decade probably desensitizes you to that money to some extent.
Without a doubt, yeah. After a while, it is, and I say this being very aware that, and we might talk about this, I suppose, but in the world of real business, what I'm earning is nothing. It's a very different world, I think, when you go from the online product creator, course creator, mentor, coach type space to owning an actual business in the real world. You realize that, most guys make what in our space we might make in a year, they make it in like a day or hours or whatever. So I think you have to bear that in mind. But certainly, there's a level of desensitification, if that's a word. And then also think you mentioned about kind of building a presence and that kind of stuff. Yeah, audience and networking definitely helps as well. So spending to accumulate, I, from a practical sense, worked on really building my email list. So I put a lot of money into cold traffic to do that. And then just kind of networking with people, really. And I know networking is one of those phrases where it has certain connotations, as in it can feel quite forced and quite sleazy. But I like to think that the way I've tried to do it has been very much, again, another buzzword, but quite authentic, and just getting to
It's been within your wheelhouse as well. It has been like reaching out to people that you like their ideas and their thoughts, going on podcasts with people within our network. Obviously, you and I both get on really well with Fergus Crawley, and that was a great conversation for you guys to network on. And that sometimes leads to business opportunities down the line, or at least just being seen by people who might relate to you in a way that are like, oh, I'd really like to work with that guy. And you showed support for the podcast and sponsored the run of episodes where you were showing people what you do for a living now and kind of enabling them to go and do that as well. So there's all sorts of different forms of networking, isn't there? And they have to be ones that you're comfortable with. For example, I just came back today from Manchester, and I was at a networking event last night where it is drinks and canapes at a table, into a talk and a keynote and a panel discussion, and then back into the networking event. I don't imagine that's absolutely your cup of tea, Mike, when it comes to that kind of thing.
Not particularly. I'm perfectly happy to do in-person stuff. When it's forced, I'm not so good with it. So yeah, I've been to a few of those events before, and they can be fine, but I've always found that I've personally never got business from those type of things. I have got business from going to seminars and talking to people and going out for dinner with people afterwards. I host my own event every year so that anyone who's bought into me at any point can come along and do a bit of networking with each other, because I think we're all very much on the same page.
Yeah.
So for me, it has to be, would I enjoy it if there was no business outcome to this? And I'm definitely very much an introvert in terms of I'm perfectly happy speaking to people. I can sort of, turn the confidence on when needed. But like most introverts, I can find that kind of thing draining. So I tend to maybe not avoid it, but limit it. So if I'm going to go and do something, that has to be, would I do this if I had no prospect of earning any money from it? Absolutely, I still would, because it would be fun.
That's a good framework, isn't it? Would I do this if it wasn't financially beneficial for me? And if it's way outside of your wheelhouse or way outside of your enjoyment sphere, then maybe you're forcing yourself to do something that's not necessary.
Yeah, I certainly think for me, again, coming back to the values element and being in a lucky position to be able to do this, but I like to have it so at least 80% of my work is stuff that I actively enjoy. And the rest of it, I might tolerate the rest of it, or it might be actually I don't really like it, but it's just something you have to do. I try and take that approach to most things, in that you're never going to love every single minute of what you do. I think that if you believe that, you're probably setting yourself up for failure. And that whole idea of if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life is not really true. There'll still be days that massively feel like work, and you will think, actually, I'd rather be in an office now, knowing that I can go home at 5 o'clock and I've got someone who's saying to me, yeah, actually, if you just get this done, you're fine, rather than if I don't get this done myself and force myself to work, actually, what will the ramifications of that be? But yeah, for the most part, enjoyment is a big factor. I would take enjoyment over extra money in the bank from a business standpoint most of the time.
Yeah, speaking of money in the bank, you wrote an email talking about almost a decade of earning 6 figures, which is the kind of, like, I recently had Andy Hart on the podcast, who's a financial advisor, and he quoted Charlie Munger, who said the first 100K is a bitch. And that is absolutely true. You see it across every business. You see it across every corporate career as well. You see it across every investment portfolio. But once you get there and sustain it, I think I've spoken to a lot of guests who've maybe done it for a couple of years. They've maybe scaled it well beyond that as well, become like maybe millions, maybe 500,000, like you've spoken about. But to do it for a long period of time, I guess it allows you to let some of the lessons and ideas from that sink in. And I really enjoyed your email on it, particularly as you're such a skilled copywriter, Mike. You obviously write good emails. But what were some of the key things? And I guess one of them you've already spoken about is that more money doesn't necessarily equal happiness. But what else kind of came to the fore across this 8-9 years of earning quite a significant sum of money?
I think it's the idea that revenue and profit aren't the same was a big one. And even profit and lifestyle aren't the same. As in, I know that certainly the first few years of doing relatively well from an earnings standpoint, I wouldn't say I didn't enjoy life. I was perfectly happy, but I've always said that probably the time I can think about in my business career I was happiest was when I started out doing okay-ish as a personal trainer, which would have been, I was probably 21, 22. I was doing 3 or 4 sessions a day, a bit of writing work, bringing in probably about $2,000 a month, but had total freedom and had that excitement of thinking, I'm actually doing my own thing here and being my own boss, which is really cool. And in a way, you'll never recapture that again, because it is a feeling. It's like the first time you do most things, you can't quite recreate that feeling and that sensation. But I went through a phase where actually I kept thinking I'm getting further and further away from that, despite financially doing a bit better.
In terms of enjoyment?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I felt a lot more pressure to keep growing the business to a certain extent. Whereas when I started out, I didn't. It was very much, if I can earn as much as I'd be earning in a 9 to 5, but working on my own terms, working a bit less than 40 hours a week, I'll be perfectly happy. And then the goalpost shifts, I suppose. And so you end up thinking, I need to do better than last year. And that can often come at the expense of a lot of other things. So wasn't traveling as much, despite the fact that in theory I probably could have done. Put harder deadlines on myself, work more hours because you think, oh, I've got clients to serve and what if I don't, and all that kind of stuff. So I think the last 2 years, it's been that realization of actually, yes, revenue, finances, that kind of stuff matters. And you're always going to say that when you're not struggling for money necessarily. So I'm super conscious that it's not going to apply. It's on a sliding scale. But yeah, at the same time, it was thinking, what are my values? What do I want to achieve? Is this taking me the direction I want to go to? And probably around about 2019, I realized that it likely wasn't. So yeah, the last few years have certainly been a case of, okay, still do what you need to do to raise revenue, but with a purpose in mind rather than just working harder, earning more.
Profit-wise, businesses like yours are typically quite profitable and high margin because you're selling a skill set that doesn't have massive overheads, in that you don't have, well, you're the coffee shop copywriter, you don't have massive expenses for an office or travel to and from clients, and equally that would be deductibles from that. But profit and revenue are definitely not the same thing, because you do see some businesses brag massively about huge turnovers. And by the time this episode comes out, I'll release my episode with Paul Richardson, who is well known for being the executive chairman at Gymshark and now Hera. But before that, he was a man that ran waste management businesses where the profit could be as low as like 2-3%, and you'd be considered a good business. Whereas an online business that you're talking about, which is scaled to £500,000 revenue, the margin should be significantly higher. And I guess that's a story of hope for some people, but also some realization for some people that necessarily just shouting about what comes in the door isn't the be all and the end all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, my margins are around about 60% profit, which you say is pretty healthy, really, but still lower in terms of margin wise than it would have been a few years ago. Because again, you scale, you have increased costs, whether that's, for me, it's certainly kind of systems and automation and software has been a bit of an increase. Other people that I pay, so I don't have employed staff because that's not what I want personally. I don't want to be responsible for someone else's sole income. But in terms of money spent on freelancers, and then, like I said, they're spending money on traffic, because I do think that at a certain level, unless you've got influencer status, you do need to spend to get more eyeballs on your stuff, so to speak. So yeah, those have been kind of extra expenses and to kind of move the margins a bit. But yeah, it's definitely a case that I think you need to be aware of those margins. But I've always said to people, I'd rather be doing 50k a year that's 90% profit than doing maths in my head, but 250 a year that's only 10% profit. Because actually all that does is gives you something extra to brag about, really, which doesn't do that much.
It doesn't do a lot for you given where your head's at now.
Yeah.
Interesting. We were laughing when we trained the other night that I was telling you that it would be amazing to release a podcast series of the conversations that you have before recording and after recording, particularly over StreamYard or remotely when I'm having them, because you kind of have a bit of a break the ice at the start, and then afterwards they quite often have a bit of chat with you quite loosely. And I found out in a conversation, I won't say who this is regarding, that there's some founders out there that have been releasing like kind of business, like entrepreneurship coaching. And when they were announcing like, oh, I'm a X-figure entrepreneur, they were adding together like various years of turnover for their business and saying, oh, I'm for argument's sake, a £30 million entrepreneur, which is multiple years of turnover. And the gentleman that I was talking to was just shaking his head saying, it's crazy how some of the marketing for this stuff is just all about revenue, but also just revenue across a huge period, which is just completely irrelevant. Like, it's just not necessary, and no mention of profit whatsoever. That 30 million across, let's say for argument's sake, 5 years could have been actually loss making, for argument's sake, if the overheads were large enough.
I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, unfortunately. And again, it's a lot more prevalent in the online space than in the world of real business, in my opinion. But yeah, it's definitely a big one in terms of, as you say, the extrapolation as well is another one. As in, I don't tend to see this from individuals themselves, but often business coaches will say, oh, I've taken X many people to a 6-figure income, just to use the very cliched phrase. And it will be more a case of, oh, well, they did 8,000 or whatever in months 1 and 2, or in month 1 and again in month 2, and they've extrapolated out, which, as we all know, that's, that
feast
often
and famine
doesn't
happens.
Yeah,
it really
yeah.
does. If you launch a course that's only open for a set period, the intake should be much higher during those months.
Yeah. And at the same time, you can do something like, if you've got an existing audience, whether it's social media, email list, whatever, you put out an initial offer to them. Yeah, lots of people might snap it up, but you've thrown your offer out there to everyone in your current network. Yes, and more people might buy later down the line, but you're never going to have that influx again of sales. So yeah, you might make 10 grand month 1, 8 grand month 2. Pretty soon you're at 2 and 3. Okay, you can get that up again, but that's going to cost you in terms of building a bigger audience. So you have to pay for traffic. So yeah, it just seems a bit, not straight up lying, but certainly disingenuous.
Absolutely. And lifestyle's a big part of the disingenuous piece, but I understand that you've obviously learned some big lessons in terms of your lifestyle and how you've managed it when it comes to freedom. But what have you learned from like a managing money perspective now that you've had access to like fairly large sums for a long period?
I'd say definitely living within your means is a big one, which is very boring, but I've made the mistake before where it's been your income goes up a certain percentage and you suddenly thought, oh, well, I can go out and have a nicer car or move house. And I've done both of those. I don't regret doing them, but at the same time, I almost overnight went from a period of thinking I've got very little financial stress at all to thinking, okay, now I'm paying X amount a month for a car, or my mortgage is over doubled because I thought,
both of which are fixed costs as well.
Yeah, 100%. So like I said, I don't regret either of those because they didn't backfire. I enjoyed.
You grew again, so you were safe enough, yeah.
Yeah, but it's one of those things where I think from a financial security point of view, if your income goes up, say 10%, it's probably smart not to raise your expenses by more than 5%. Certainly not in your lifestyle anyway. I mean, business expenses, I do think you have to speculate to accumulate. There's a degree of risk. You're often going to have to spend more than you might like to, make a loss initially, especially if you're talking something like running cold traffic, media buying, that kind of thing. But in your day-to-day life, is what you're spending money on actually making you that much happier? I try and think about that a lot before I buy something now, in terms of, am I really going to get pleasure from it ongoing, or will it be just a material thing that actually in a couple of months' time I'm thinking, oh, that's, either I spent that money as a one-off and it's not really, I've not got joy from it, or it's a monthly commitment that I'm now tied into paying for that, I didn't need, and the novelty is definitely worn off.
I can understand that. I know you've got a bit of a rule when it comes to purchasing. How do you put that into practice?
So it's definitely stolen and somewhat bastardized from Ramit Sethi, but the kind of idea is you have 3 levels, and level 1 is things you love and you almost have no budget for. Obviously, there is a budget because you can only spend so much, but if you're super passionate about 1 or 2 things, if you can afford something within those domains, you should probably go and buy it because you're going to love it. The second level is anything that makes your life easier or more convenient. So if it's things like having an accountant, having a cleaner, if it's stuff like coaching, perhaps, that sort of thing. Even if you're super busy, if actually buying ready-made meals makes your life easier and more convenient. We all know it's not the most sensible use of money on paper because it's the whole, you buy it and actually if you made it all at home and batch cooked, you could do it so much cheaper. But if actually doing that saves you half an hour a day and you're super busy, that's a level 2 item because it makes sense. And then everything else should fall in level 3. And level 3 is the whole budget aggressively idea, whereby for me, that's like with my weekly food shop, I do not care about brands. I'm one of those people who I will eat anything and I'll be happy. So I buy the cheapest of the cheap when I go food shopping because I'm not that fussed really. If I go out to eat, I couldn't care less about fine dining. So it will be a cheap meal out and it doesn't bother me. Things like tech as well, like my iPhone's about 4.5 years old, but I just don't care about technology. So anything that I don't feel like is actually going to improve my life, I just don't spend on at all. And I really try and budget aggressively for it, which sort of goes against the idea of a lot of people say, oh, well, if you stop buying your latte every day, that'd be a good way to save money. And you think, well, it is, because a £4 latte is hideously overpriced, but you've got to weigh up, actually, do I really enjoy that in the morning and does it set me up for the day? If so, you should probably keep on buying it.
That's in your level 1, doesn't it?
Yeah. And if you don't really care about it, then yeah, you probably should stop buying it. But it's very much case dependent rather than just you should do this or shouldn't do that.
What sits in level 1 for you apart from the coffees, obviously?
What sits in level 1 for me? So I would say broad term, but probably experiences, as in going new places, trying new things. I'm always happy to pay for learning new skills, I suppose. I was never a car guy, but actually my car would be now. Every time I sit in my car, I enjoy it. So certainly for the time being, I can't see myself having anything too different from that, to be honest. And yeah, they're probably the main things, to be honest. And coaching stuff as well, I think, in terms of...
You're always willing to spend on coaches because you're in some mastermind groups, which will not be cheap by any means, but you're almost insensitive to that cost because it's not relevant.
Yeah, and anything I put through the business, I don't think of as my money either. It's very much this is the business's money, which probably is something else that actually I think when you get to a certain level, having a business bank account and paying yourself from that and everything else stays in the business, that's another good piece of advice that I should say I'm not a financial advisor, so it's not financial advice, but from a financial security point of view, I'd say it's worth doing that for people. But yeah, coaching stuff I'm always happy to pay for because I think, well, actually, it takes away a lot of the thought process of it. I'm happy to outsource the thinking to someone else because they do it better than I do anyway. And if it's something I care about, getting better at that is a big priority for me. So yeah, I'm perfectly happy. I take the piss out of myself how many coaches I have. It's like anything sort of fitness related and business related, almost don't really think for myself, but I'm perfectly happy to do that.
You were asking me this in the gym as well. You're like, oh, who's doing your coaching just now? What are you doing? And I was saying, oh, I'm pretty much just running my own training and stuff like that. And you were like, oh, I'm outsourced.
Yeah.
Every decision making on these things.
Yeah, basically. And certainly sometimes I think, do you know what, I used to quite enjoy planning my own training to a degree. But I always think if you've got a coach who you like and who you trust, for me, I'm perfectly happy to put it in their hands. And I still think that, especially with training, it's not like you have to do every single session to the letter of what they tell you. There's a spectrum you would work on. Same in business, if something is important to you and you've gone to an expert, you should probably do the thing they say to you. So with my business mentor, for example, if I'm coming up to a launch and he tells me to do something, I will do exactly what he guides me on. And a lot of the time it will be actually what I've sent him. He'll say, yep, that'll work. Just go out and do it. And I'll do it. Other times he'll say to me, well, you should probably tweak a few bits here. Outside of anything like a launch, I kind of do my own thing. And if I go to him and he thinks actually that's a really bad idea, he'll tell me. But the rest of the time there is some leeway there anyway. So I think with coaching, people tend to see it as like I have to do absolutely every single last thing I'm told, or I'm just going to wing it and do it myself. And I think it's probably a middle ground depending on what results you want to get out of it.
Yes, yeah, can completely see that. And one of the last points you made does relate a little bit to the lifestyle side of things, but it was around saving being obviously something that's a little bit boring. But how have you noticed your ability to do that as your income scaled?
I think in terms of probably relating to what I said about the expenses, your personal expenses going up as your income goes up, I might even go against that with saving by, let's say you're putting money into a pension every month. If your income goes up 20%, I would personally think, well, actually, I'm probably going to increase my pension contributions to about that much as well. Because to me, that probably makes sense. I know that some people might say, oh, you should invest into X or Y or whatever, or pensions don't work so and so. But whatever your choice of investment is, if you're confident that's going to pay out long term and benefit you in the future, it's probably wise to put a bit more into that, I would say. And again, just setting yourself, I'm not a huge budgeter, but if you can set yourself a monthly budget and then save back everything that you've not spent, it's really basic advice. It's boring, but a key value for me is financial security and not thinking, oh my God, I'm in a situation where I need to make another 15 grand this month. I have to do a launch and this has to be successful. When I do a launch, I want to go out there because I've got something I want to launch. I think it will help people, but actually I don't want to be waking up every morning thinking I need to go and check my Stripe account, see how much has gone into it. You get to the last day and maybe you've not made as many sales and all of a sudden you're in scarcity mode thinking, I'm just going to bombard the list with 7 emails today, or I'm going to discount it, whatever, because that's not the way I like to do things. I'd rather have a laid back approach and be thinking, actually, you know what? It's just a launch. If it doesn't go to plan, so be it. I'll go on to the next one. I can still be happy with what I've done because I believed in the product I've put out there.
The percentage increases thing's interesting because a lot of the actual financial advisors I've had in the show, like Andy Hart and even Pete Matthew before him, they do talk about if somebody gets a salary increase of a certain percentage, they'll have like not an argument, but a discussion. How much of that do you think you should increase your investments by? And some people radically underestimate what their future self would benefit most from, and they tend to pleasure their current self. And it's a total battle between instant gratification or relatively instant gratification and then the delayed gratification of it. And while all of these guys are very big on make sure you live and enjoy the experiences now, it's a case of don't necessarily increase your fixed expenses like your car and your mortgage. With this little bump, try and serve yourself to some extent. It doesn't have to be the full percentage, but fight yourself on the initial percentage that you want to do, because it's probably lowballed more often than not.
Yeah, I suppose like in a lot of things, it's what would your future self thank you for? And obviously there can be a detriment to that. Like you say, if it stops you from living in the here and now, I know people who have very stringent lifestyles, and I think, I'm not sure I want to go to that degree. You know, in 20 years time, they'll probably be, you know, doing really well for themselves. But at the same time,
is the struggle worth it though? Like I've spoken to one FIRE guy, so financial independence, retired at 35, but some of the stuff he was doing before that, I was like, not great. And what everyone always forgets, these guys were earning serious money. Like him and his wife combined were about 240k salary. Obviously they're getting pension contributions from their employer and they're squirreling this money, but they're also just living like very frugally to an extent that you would almost call it tight or thrifty, that you wouldn't even like, you wouldn't put yourself through for the freedom that you get, and or depending how fast that freedom came.
Yeah, and I certainly think that I watched a video the other day of a guy on YouTube who owned some Airbnb properties and rented them out, but he himself lived in a one-bed tiny studio in New York, and his idea was, I want to retire by 35. So yeah, he's still in Manhattan, but he's paying like $1,100 a month for a midtown Manhattan apartment, which is super, super cheap, obviously. Yeah, he's in a space that is, I mean, I don't even want to compare it to the size of this room because it's like a fifth of the size of this room. It's like a double bed and a sink and that's it. And you think, if he's actually happy with that, and I think he probably was, that's perfectly fine. But
he's wired differently to most people though. And we all have outliers in different fields. Like there's particular people who are wired a particular way to exceed in particular domains. And we have to sometimes accept he's built different and he's applied himself, or he's consumed content that has made him in this way and he's happy with it for the next however long.
Yeah. But I think for a lot of people, that amount of sacrifice would just be miserable. And as ridiculous as the phrase is, you could get hit by a bus tomorrow, or automobile of choice. And it's one of those things where there has to be a balance. So I know people who live by that all the time and will say, I'm just going to spend it because I'll enjoy it. And you think, it's fine, but you're also probably not actually enjoying it. Maybe that's me psychoanalyzing, but I kind of think, I'm not so sure. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum where it is save, not going to live for anything. I'm going to spend 10 minutes analyzing every financial decision. You should probably just gone and bought the thing, because otherwise you just spend your life making decisions. That should end up in
level 1.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay. I very much see you as a master of the written word with all the copywriting you do, but you recently started Toastmasters. What made you decide to try and improve at your public speaking?
So this year's definitely been the year of learning new skills, I would say, for me. I just wanted to get better at certain things. So I personally felt that I was getting very comfortable being comfortable. And I've got a life that I really enjoy, but it was the case that probably 4 weeknights out of 5, I'd wrap up work about 7 o'clock, 7:30ish. I would get home, I'd make some dinner, I'd sit on the sofa watching TV, and I was happy doing that. But I thought, in 10 years, if you're still doing this, you're going to be happy. And I thought, there's one thing at 32 being like that, another thing at 42, you know, see friends, I've got an active social life, but it was in the back of my mind nagging away, thinking you kind of need to get out there a bit more, do a few different things. So overarching concept has been get out there, do stuff that maybe not scares you, because I think I'm generally fairly willing to take on challenges, but takes a bit of an effort to go out and do. And with Toastmasters, one of the things was, I've never really minded speaking, as in I used to be very introverted, very shy, would hate it, but just doing a bit of it, I got fairly confident.
You've done a lot of seminars now, you've done a lot of podcasts, you'll be comfortable.
Yeah, so it doesn't bother me, but I've always felt I've done okay with it, but I wanted to be that person where you go and deliver a presentation and people still remember it 6 months down the line, which I felt that I definitely wasn't. And so that just seemed like a very obvious thing to have a go at, in terms of rock up, you learn a bit, you see some other people, and ultimately it makes you do it. Because I think there's a time and a place for reading about stuff, and there's a time and a place for doing stuff. Most people over prioritize the reading stuff and don't do the doing stuff enough. And so, yeah, that was basically the aim of it, was go somewhere I'm going to be forced, not physically forced, but in your own mind, you'll be forced to get up and present. And yeah, so I just decided to rock up and give it a go.
How did that first session go?
It was good, actually. Yeah, it was, well, I did actually get up and give it a go when they asked for volunteers. So I thought, well,
how busy was the room, and like how many are like regular attendees and how many newbies are there?
So for that one, there are about 30 there at the time. I believe they have about 100 members. Some will kind of phone in virtually. Some will be in the room. And then it's very much a case of, if you want to turn up, you can do. If not, you don't have to. And he said there's normally around about 30 or so in that meeting. But there was a big variance of levels, I would say, as in there are a few people who've been in their ages, and they had, how would you define it? Leadership, managerial positions within the club. Quite a few people who had English as a second language, which I thought, good on you, because that's not a lot of people who've got English as a first language wouldn't do that kind of thing. And you're turning up and giving it, like I wouldn't do that in another country. So yeah, I was impressed at that. And then quite a wide range of people. I thought it'd probably be mostly middle-aged executives, of which there were a few, but yeah, there were a lot of students. It's probably a 50-50 split, male to female as well. So it was we might talk about this, a diverse crowd. You know, that's I know, yeah. But it generally was a diverse crowd in terms of genders, ages, backgrounds. You know, what people are doing. But yeah, I think part of me was a bit surprised that I felt a lot of people were even fresher than me doing it. And I think I maybe had underestimated that actually, yeah, having done, I don't know, probably about 20 odd live talks to people in crowds of various sizes, actually, that probably gives you a bit more competence than you might think. So,
and more experience than most people.
Yeah, so actually I was surprised when they asked for volunteers and very few people volunteered. I thought, oh, might as well give it a go then, really, because, yeah, what else are you going to do?
Yeah, that's good you volunteered on your first session. What were you asked to do?
So it was what they call table talk, I think, which was you go up to the front and they say, okay, your topic is, and they give you a topic and you have to talk for between 1 and 2 minutes on it. And then with this one, it was you were given a question to answer. So got up to the front and it's, okay, your question is, would you ever go skydiving? Which, if I'm honest, I think is quite a lowball question. It's not exactly, what do you think?
It was your first time, like the artesian.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Warm me up.
But it was more difficult than I thought it'd be, because that's kind of a yes or no answer with maybe a sentence or two elaboration, which you're talking about 20 seconds. So I think in the end I managed just under a minute and a half. But you do have to make sure you're staying on theme. You have to make sure that, I suppose, it's engaging to a degree. Obviously you're trying to do all the stuff you should be speaking, so a bit of hand movement, changing vocal tonality, making eye contact with people, not sort of shuffling around, all that kind of stuff. But it was a really good challenge. I could definitely see how, I suppose one of the reasons I should say I went as well is because I think public speaking doesn't just make you a better public speaker, it makes you probably a more interesting person, a better conversationalist. The benefits of it spread much wider than just speaking on a stage to people. I've kind of lost track where I was going with that. But yeah, so
by putting yourself into that domain, you sharpen your skills and you leave yourself no option really. And you I suppose the lesson was initially that you're actually better than you thought you were, but equally I'm going to put myself in this new experience more often and try and see if I can improve.
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, too many people want to stay in their comfort zone all the time. So comfort zones are always relative and they work on a sliding scale as well. So it's not like you're going onto the front line and fighting a foreign forces. But again, it's something that I think you probably should do, something that challenges you every day, even if it's just a mild challenge that's slightly more so than usual. It's probably not a bad idea to get out there and do some stuff like that.
Of course. And you've been getting out there and doing endurance events since we last spoke. 7 in the last almost 2 years, something like that.
Yeah, I think I've now done 7 ultras in, about 20 months or so. Yeah.
Yeah, you fairly packed them in, because I think the first one I had noted down was like June 21. So that was just after we spoke for the first time on the show. And from there, you've been like a fairly regular competitor.
Yeah, I tried to squeeze a few in. So I, again, with a lot of stuff, I think, well, maybe not go all in on it. I know people who do an ultra marathon every month or so, which is, I would think that's absolutely hell. But yeah, the goal has been to gradually sort of push what I'm capable of and take on some new challenges with that.
What does gradual build up and progressive overload look like for endurance events? Like, how did you start and where are we now?
So the first event I did was, June 2021. And that was, I think it was 53.5 miles. So that was a race on the South Downs near me. And essentially the reason why I got into it is because, like a lot of people in lockdown, I got bored of just doing press-ups in my shed and lunges around the garden. Started doing a bit of running, did a half marathon, and thought that was quite fun. I'll do a marathon next. And then I listened to an interview with a guy called Ross Edgley, who, I know that you'll know him, but he's the guy who swam around Britain. He did a triathlon carrying a tree, like loads of crazy stuff. And he was on a podcast saying, people should do marathons, but actually, if you go a bit further, that's technically an ultra marathon, and that's a lot cooler. And obviously, when you add the word ultra to anything, it definitely makes it cooler. So I thought, hey, he's got a good idea, actually. So I signed up for a 24-hour race, and the guy who'd coached me for the half marathon I did said, maybe we'll do an interim race for that, because 24 hours you're running is quite a long time when you've only done a half marathon. So we trained up for this 53 miler, and actually went really well. I think for that, I definitely had a lot of naivety. And that was a benefit, I reckon, because my longest training run before that had been about 27.5 miles. So you're almost doubling it. And I remember being out there about mile 40 thinking, this is a lot different to doing just 2 of my previous training runs back to back. But it's a really cool learning experience. I actually did relatively well. I finished sort of top 20 out of about 900 people, which made me think, actually, maybe
have some aptitude for this.
Yeah.
Because previously you were a powerlifter and you were moving like pretty significant weight versus body weight.
Yeah, so I've done a bit of running in the past, but it only ever been 10Ks. And then, the powerlifting took over. And I'm always the first one to admit I was a pretty mediocre powerlifter. I'm certainly not getting close to any records or anything, but I'd always consider myself more of a strength athlete, really. So it was a bit of a surprise to go, actually, you're not too bad at suffering non-stop for about 8 hours. And I think I just got the bug from it, really. The next one I did was a last runner standing type race. So you do a 4.2 mile loop on the hour, every hour, until there's only one person going round. And that was really interesting, because my goal for that was to hit 100 miles, which I managed, and then hit the 100, and it was almost like a switch in my brain flipped, and it went, that's fine, you're happy with that, you're done. And
you pre-agreed that 100%. Your brain had decided before you'd started, if I do the 100, that's it.
Yep. And I think in many ways it was good to set that goal, because I'd got to about 80 miles and thought, my feet are in pieces here, I need to stop. But also thought, well, actually, it's 20 miles left, but in comparison to what you've done, that's not a whole lot left. On the flip side, when I got to that, the 100 miles I set myself, you convince yourself you're perfectly happy with that. And the next day I woke up and thought, no, I wasn't happy with that. I don't know why I stopped. The body's not given up. You walked to the car afterwards perfectly happily. So that was another good lesson in terms of, okay, you can push yourself quite hard, but when your brain says you're done, you're probably not anywhere close to being done. So that was,
interesting. I imagine when you push yourself to that limit of what a human's capable of in terms of their physical capabilities, as you've done numerous times since, there's lots of things that you learn about yourself each time round.
I heard a quote the other day from, it's one of the top female ultra runners, I can't remember who it was, but she was saying that she feels you do about a year's worth of personal growth when you run a 100-mile race. Got no way of quantifying that, but I also think that that's probably not far off the truth. Certainly if you don't tend to push yourself normally, pushing yourself to that degree, learning a lot about your body, what you can tolerate, learning a lot about the mind, learning a lot about what scares you as well. I've certainly found that for me, it's not necessarily the physical exertion side of things and the pain that scare me. It's things like, as ridiculous as it sounds, getting lost has been the big thing. That's the challenge for me.
You did get lost in one of them, didn't you?
Yep, the one that finished about 10 miles from my house. I got lost right at the end of it. So yeah, another 52 miler that I end up doing 55 miles. So
3 extra for a walk.
I mean, yeah, they often joke with ultras anyway that the distance that's listed is often not the distance you're supposed to do. So this one was called the Testway 50, thinking it's 50 miles. You turn up and the race director says, actually, it's like 52.2. We just call it the 50 to round it down. Like, a lot of people go out for a 2.2 mile run as their training run, and you're saying, oh, we're just going to add that on the end of it.
When you're fatigued.
Yeah. So I've realized that that's a weakness for me. That's something that you could put me on a track and say to me, you got to run 100 miles. I think it's a bit of a slog, but okay. You could put me on a very remote course and say you've got to run 20 miles. I'll pick that track race all day because I know for that my brain can switch off. Whereas somewhere where they go, you've got to navigate yourself. That for me is more of a challenge. So yeah, you learn sort of the practical things about yourself. And I suppose the biggest one has been essentially telling your brain to shut up. Sometimes it can work for you, but it can definitely work against you.
You combined your lifting passion and your running passion in September when you did what was it called? The 1,100?
Yes.
For the right way around.
Correct, yeah.
So our mutual friend Fergus is a big fan of using numbers that signify something and combining that into some sort of running and some sort of athletic pursuit alongside some sort of strength pursuit. What's the 1,100?
So for that, the goal was to do a powerlifting total of £1,000, which I think is 455 kilos. So I chose to broke down the numbers. I think I did a 155 kilo squat, 110 kilo bench press, 190 kilo deadlift. And then from that, go straight into a 100-mile run with a self-imposed cutoff of 24 hours. So yeah, I did that in September. The total wasn't too bad. I sort of picked numbers that would be doable.
But reached 1,000, which is the important part. And again, you and I were talking about this off camera at the gym the other night, and you were saying, oh, well, I almost felt like I left a little bit in the tank on the deadlift in particular because you pulled much heavier than 190 before. But all the work that you'd done to be able to pull 190 at 80-85% of your max, that should count towards the ability for you to create these numbers too. I suppose like for the 1,000 to be an attainable total took a lot of work behind the scenes.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And it was certainly one of those things where I thought, yeah, the numbers were a bit, I wouldn't say gimmicky, but in a sense, you could think, well, why not 1,050 and 101 miles? You know, there's so many ways you could do it. They are just numbers, but it was planned so that I knew it'd be, you couldn't coast it. You'd have to train hard. They'd still be difficult lifts, but they'd be probably the second lift you do in a powerlifting competition out of 3, maybe your opener, but somewhere between that level in order to not injure yourself for the 100-mile run, just because, I mean, 100-mile run, they can vary in difficulty and whatever. And I've certainly had some that have been horrendous and some, that one actually, in the end, it was okay. I actually quite enjoyed most of it, but I almost wanted to enjoy some of it as well and didn't want to be finishing those lifts thinking, yeah, I've completely fried my CNS or I've pulled something slightly, because even a very slight twinge I found on runs before, 100 miles, you're probably covering about 200,000 steps. So a slight twinge multiplied 200,000 times every time your foot hits the floor, it gets to be a bit more than a slight twinge by the end of it. So yeah, the numbers were picked quite strategically. And then, yeah, the goal of the run was really to actually have some fun with it and enjoy it. And again, the 24 hours was always a kind of a worst case scenario, because I was pretty sure I could run it a fair bit quicker than that. And I think in the end it was about 40, I think the lifts took about 47 minutes. So I started the timer as soon as I did the first squat. And then the run was 19 hours, 18 minutes, I think, for the whole thing.
Huge day, isn't it?
It's a pretty long day. Yeah. Started at 11 o'clock on the Saturday, finished at about 7:05 on the Sunday morning.
Oh my goodness. What's the recovery like from something like that?
I would say probably full recovery, 6 or 7 weeks or so. I'd say. I mean, it's
cognitive and physical.
I tend to find that I'm quite eager to get back into stuff about 3 weeks after. So I have about 1 or 2 weeks where I think I can't really be bothered with that, or I don't know if I want to run an ultra again. And then normally about 3 weeks after, you tend to sort of get the drive and motivation back. Physically, I mean, it depends. I know that for me, the key things that I find are CNS is totally fried, even though that long distance running typically isn't seen as a CNS dominant activity. One thing I found interesting that I know a lot of people talk about grip strength being quite a good indicator of how you are cognitively and how your overall strength is as well. I've found after any ultra I've done, I really struggle to pick up a 20 kilo plate in a pinch grip. I just can't hold it.
Wow.
Which is quite a surprise actually, but I think that's a good indicator that, yeah, overall strength is really, really down. So I tend to take about 4 days fully off. I do a couple of upper body sessions quite light, and then get back into some form of training after about 7 to 10 days. The running's always interesting because you'll go out and do a run, but your body almost physically won't let your heart rate go too high. So I've had it before where I've been running and it's not felt that difficult. Your heart rate's been maybe like 135, 140, but you just can't move any quicker. And it's almost like your body puts that barrier in place to protect you, to say, no, you've done this pretty big thing.
Come on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's always, I find it fascinating. For me, probably the worst bit is always the feet. Like they do suffer really. And there's an argument so I could be better with foot care as well. But I mean, you're running 100 miles, so your feet are going to be in a bit of a state anyway.
Yeah, of course. No, it's interesting. And I guess what's left for you to fulfill in that area? Are you going to do something number based again?
There's still quite a lot I want to do for definite, because I think I've not even really scratched the surface of it, because there are so many different variations of ultras. And then when you add in the lifting as well, at the moment, there's no desire to do anything other than running and lifting. So I'm not going to do triathlon based stuff, anything like that. But certainly my numbers based one for this year will be, I'm going to shoot for a 500 pound deadlift and a double marathon, with a double marathon being under 8 hours. So still some logistics to work out for that, but that will probably be my big September one. And then outside of that, I quite like, sounds a bit odd, but I like races that are runnable. So a lot of the big things like in the desert, or the big one in France, UTMB, where it's all up and down, they don't massively appeal to me, because a lot of it is hiking, which for me, it's still incredibly difficult, but it's a different type of hard. So my goal is sort of increase my distance over 24 miles if I can. So I've got another 24-hour event this year that I'll do. And then some of the big races, certainly out in the States, would be quite good fun to do. So you've got things like the Leadville 100, you've got the Moab 240, which is 240 miler. So yeah, maybe a couple of years time, I reckon I might start stepping up to sort of the 200 mile plus distances. But for me at the moment,
there's loads more to explore. And like you say, that nice combination between having a strong lifting background does enable you to do some of the number stuff, which I know tremendously excites you. But also, and we were saying about Fergus, like he's got untapped opportunities to create these new mad events that he can just continue to explore.
That's what I love about it as well, because again, I'm hyper aware that I'm not the best powerlifter by a long, long way. I'm not the best ultra runner by a long, long way. But much like Fergus, put us in a gym with a load of runners, we're going to outperform anyone there. Put you on a running course with a load of powerlifters, no one else is keeping up. So it's like that idea that yes, you would be a better runner if you if you did less weight training. You'd be a better lifter if you did less running, but I know that I'm never going to excel at either. So for me, there's a lot more joy from an intrinsic standpoint, not in terms of, oh yes, I won that race, because I don't really care where I come in races. It's more about how I do personally. But I get a lot more pleasure out of thinking I'm better than average, or I'm good at two disciplines, rather than being very good in one and then maybe not even attempting the other one.
Yes, and I think, as you said right at the top of this podcast, was I'm freeing up bandwidth to explore more of these endurance events by not downscaling business, but by not pushing my business to the absolute maximum figure that it could be. And I can completely see how by doing that, there's a trade-off, and it's allowing you to find enjoyment as well. Like, I think I've said, again, conversations that we've had off record, I enjoy my corporate job still, but I'm pretty relentlessly trying to build the podcast because I really enjoy it. And if I feel I've got enough bandwidth to do well in my corporate job and to do well at the podcast, if the podcast became such a strain on my corporate job, I would have to I'd have to think about it, wouldn't I? Or if I took on more of my corporate job that meant I had to strip away some of the aspects of my own training or my own lifestyle, whatever, you'd have to have a conversation about that as well, because you only do have a limited amount of energy or units that you can allocate towards all these things that you care about.
Yeah, and you hear a lot of people talk about things like decision fatigue from having to make lots of decisions. The idea that the more, even small tasks will take some of your creativity, some of your discipline, probably some of your energy. So for me, it's been a case that certainly not wanting to kind of downsize the business at all, but I would much rather, if you said to me, you can earn an extra, I don't know, up your revenue and profit 20% next year, but training has to be a bit of an afterthought. Maybe you do a couple of ultras, but they're sort of just lower key ones and your lifting stays on par, or everything could stay the same in the business and actually you free up a bit more time. You have more energy to go and do a couple of really cool events. Which would you rather do? It's going to be that second one every single time.
Yeah. And like you say, it comes from a position of you've done the hard yards to be in that position, but it's important that you now take advantage of that. Yeah,
and that's, again, it's going to differ for everybody, because I understand not everyone is in a similar position. But yeah, if you can get to that position where you have that option, I think you've got to choose what you want. I've got mates who we started at the same time in business, we grew at about the same rate, and they're now miles and miles ahead of me. But I don't think I particularly envy them, because that's never been what I've wanted. So it's about choosing what matters to you. I mean, if you're starting a business, and for you actually having the kind of thing that I mentioned about when I was super happy when I started, of earning an average salary but working for yourself, and actually you can pick and choose your clients and you've got time and space to do other stuff outside that, I'm firmly of the belief that why would you push for more business if it's not necessarily going to give you what you want?
Yeah, no, it's a great perspective, and I'm glad you've been able to share it. But one of the last topics that we finished off our last podcast with was around freedom of speech, and it's a value that you and I both share. How do you think freedom of speech has evolved in the 18 months since we last spoke?
I think some of it has got more radical in terms of people who are trying to force it, or people who are, not force freedom of speech, but force speech and compel speech. I think we've seen probably more ridiculousness than ever, but I also think on the whole, it's got better from the point of view of people like ourselves, in terms of a lot of what I deem normal people, as in people who don't spend a lot of time online and actually, crazy enough, have lives outside of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. A lot of people I speak to like that are much more aware of some of the craziness now, in terms of you can't say this, you need to change the word for that, which I think is a good thing, because they're going, this is actually crazy. And it's not this, the changing of whatever, or excessive use of, wanting to have non-gendered language all the time. And you can't say this, you can't say that. People have realized it's actually not now just confined to liberal West Coast arts colleges. There's maybe not an agenda, that makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist, but there's a movement that want to kind of bring that to a wider,
to make it general public discourse.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people are seeing that and now fighting back against it, who just weren't aware of it a couple of years ago.
I would say so. And I think when you speak to, like you say, the average person in my work or whatever, they do find some of the stuff that's going on to be utterly ridiculous and just shaking their head. And common sense isn't common practice though. Yeah. And if we are moving to a world where language and words are more restricted and more challenged than ever before, it's not a place that I would really particularly love to be. And I think when we last spoke, 2021, the stuff around C19 was at its peak in terms of ability. Like you were asked not to comment on what was going on or any disagreement, but equally many of the people that were critical of what maybe you and I were saying at that point in time, or talking about behind closed doors at that period of time, people would have been critical about, has now been not proven to be correct, because it's not an I told you so piece, but there's maybe more understanding that, maybe it would have been healthier to have some critical voices about policy or about discussions or about language or about how things were conducted at that point in time. And I think hopefully that's a lesson that we should have more open discussion without fear or favour of cancellation or restriction of even reach of things. Because one of the things I said we might talk about was Elon Musk has bought Twitter, and that's been a very mixed bag, because I think you were talking to me about the feed being full of random accounts that you don't follow, because kind of going the same way as like Instagram and TikTok in that regard, where it just throws stuff at you that you maybe haven't committed to following. And people have said, oh, it's been great that Elon has allowed some people back on the platform, but equally hate speech might be up across the spectrum, both left and right, and they're kind of going at each other now as well.
Yeah, there's always, I mean, with Twitter, I think you have to view it as what it is, which is it's Twitter. People don't talk to each other like that in real life in general. People are definitely more heated on it. It's a lot more polarizing. And I think the whole thing about seeing stuff that you hadn't liked, hadn't engaged with, what I've seen for the most part is people who I generally disagree with being shown to me, which I'm sure is a tactic to get more engagement, because as we know, people tend to be more motivated to get involved with something when it's a fear and outrage type
TripAdvisor.
thing. Yeah.
People write angry reviews.
Yeah, and it's for a lot of people, it's a way to vent online. So I do think it is calculated to a degree to get you to stay on the platform more, which you could definitely do with positive stuff. But then I think, yeah, Twitter's maybe a bit different to the other social media platforms in terms of it does certainly seem, from the main ones, the most volatile, the most argumentative. But yeah, from a freedom of speech standpoint, I think I see it from both sides. I mean, it's not even really a left versus right thing a lot of the time, because in my mind, what even is left versus right anymore? It's changed so much that you've got actually, initially it would be your typical old school liberal lefties who would be very much pro freedom of speech, and conservatives try to shut it down. Then we seem to do almost like a 180, and now, yeah, I listen to podcasts of people who are very pro freedom of speech who would say I'm on the left, and I listen to people who say you shouldn't be saying this who are on the right, and you think, well, the lines are just so blurred now, really. But on the whole, I think outside of a few cases, it probably has got better. I think that maybe in the corporate world, not that I'm in it, but from seeing people, I do think a lot of people are just going along with the status quo and don't actually believe it, which is very much like you said about the COVID thing. The number of people I speak to now who say, oh, I never really went along with any of it, I never believed it. And I think, but at the time, you did. So it was difficult. I'm not saying it, and as you said, it's not an I told you so thing, but you do kind of think, yeah, hopefully, if there's any lesson, it's been, I should probably speak up, because, yeah, people are kind of seeing, actually, we were told a lot of stuff that wasn't true. A lot of things have come out that were about the censorship, about all that kind of stuff that I think if you're a normal person, you would look at that and go, yeah, that's really...
You should be uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, without a doubt.
That was one of the interesting things about Twitter when Musk is releasing some of the files, where he was showing that there was repression of particular stories, the Hunter Biden laptop thing, which I wasn't particularly immersed in anyway. And I know it might have had a material impact on voting intentions. I understand that, and it shouldn't have been restricted in terms of reach. But equally, there was things like vaccine injuries or whatever else are in that kind of first lot of the rollout that were suppressed in terms of reach. And I do think that's a problem when a social media tool or app, whatever you want to call it, is suppressing stories. But equally, they're private companies. So if they're led by an individual who doesn't want that to go out there, that should also be fine. But people should be aware that these platforms have a bias in some particular way. I don't know if you've seen much about Chat GPT, but it's not going to replace your job, I don't think, Mike. I don't think it's going to replace copywriters. It's going to try to, but it has some biases within it as well. I don't know if you've looked into this at all.
I've heard a couple of podcasts around it where, and obviously you get all the screenshots and stuff, and you think, well, I don't know if that's actually true. But yeah, I've certainly seen bits where it either says, I can't answer that because it might be disparaging or it might be harmful to people. And you think, yeah, that's just, again, a bit nonsensical, really. Or as you say, it's got certain political leanings. And I do think there's a danger of that, because it could well end up being used like a search engine. And at least with Google, you get stuff, and we all know that actually the algorithm on there is filtered anyway.
Manipulated as well.
But at least you can go through and see, if you type in, just to use what you said, COVID-19 vaccine injuries, you might get the BBC, you get Fox, you get CNN, you get an independent site. At least you can go through and see a few different things. With ChatGPT, if you're just getting one answer, that to me is quite a risky
and
thing.
It learns from who it has had input from. So it's shaped by that. So if there's a bias in the programmers in behind it and the people it's learning from, then that's what it has. Because the big one that I saw was, it was asked, put forward a case for fascism or authoritarianism, and it said no, that's not possible due to guidelines, etc., etc. But then it was asked to put forward a case for communism, and it did. Now that shows that the people in behind have a sympathy towards perhaps exploring that particular ideology as a solution for society. But it's funny that if you look at it through the lens of history, both are equally problematic when put into practice. Just ask the people of Soviet Russia or Ukraine in the past.
Yeah, it's certainly the filtering or the censorship of different opinions, and we get it in all walks of life. I think obviously that's one of the big debates in US schools at the moment, is how kids are being taught in US schools, probably over here as well. And what you said was interesting about private company, because I think that's a very grey area, that it is a private company. I would class myself as very libertarian. I think I want to run my business. I want to run my business. So actually, if I get not nasty comments, sounds particularly childish, but if I get negative comments on my Facebook ads, I would just go and hide those comments. And I wouldn't want someone to say to me, no, you can't hide those because of freedom of speech. At the same time, are social media platforms a publisher or are they a platform? If you're a publisher, you're responsible for the content as far as I understand it. And so I can understand that if you were editor of The Guardian or The Telegraph, yes, you would police what was in there because you could be held liable for it. A platform, to me, and again, from my knowledge of it, I'm happy to hold my hands up if I'm wrong, that would have different rules, because you are just acting as like a public square for people, where, I mean, if you got up in...
The village idiot can come and shout if he wants.
Yeah, and as long as you're not inciting violence, and that's a whole other topic as to what constitutes inciting violence and what is violence, but just using the definition most of us would say, outside of inciting violence, you should kind of be free to say what you want, really. And unfortunately, there are downsides to that. And I think one thing that I find funny is people almost think, when you say I'm very pro freedom of speech, they think you want the freedom to offend people. And you should have the freedom to offend people, because offense is subjective. But it's not like you want to offend people necessarily. Most sane, rational people who are very pro freedom of speech understand that there might be some nasty things said and some feelings hurt, but that's a lesser evil than having someone decide you can say this, you can't say that, which is what I've always found fascinating with it, that people who want speech police don't realise that it's all well and good if you put those guidelines in under the person that you like who's policing them, but hierarchies change, who's in charge changes. If someone else comes in and goes, oh yeah, we are going to have censored speech, but now we're flipping everything around 180.
The goalposts always move, and you wouldn't be happy if they were shutting off the goalposts that you'd been shooting into previously. Yeah,
and I think it's always a very good rule of thumb that if you're going to impose some rules and it's your person or your party you like you're imposing them, how would you feel if those same rules are available to the other party? And I'm using that in a party political sense. I think that's probably the most likely way it would be used.
But applied to the same outgroup, so to speak. That makes total sense. For me, it's the shift in language and words becoming kind of unallowed or cancelable, and I think that moves so quickly that it's hard to keep pace with. And I think a lot of the words that are used, maybe from traditionally or historically, if they are now deemed offensive, that I find very difficult to keep up with, and so many of those happen all the time. And one of them in particular that I saw, and I have friends that have been not disciplined but told at work not to use it, is guys. So using hi guys within your emails or within the Teams chat or the Slack chat or whatever means you're communicating with colleagues, you've not to use the term guys because that's a gendered term. But I actually thought that guys is almost, and if people really like this term, non-binary term, like it doesn't apply to male or female in my book, but people were asked not to use it because it might offend. And I was thinking, who are we catering for that gets upset by the term guys?
I think that's the question, isn't it? Like I don't know anyone, and maybe that's the circles I'm in. I think I've got a fairly well-rounded circle of friends from different backgrounds and different genders and everything. So I don't know anyone who'd be offended by that, but it does feel like, I don't know, there's a lot of ways you could go with this. For me, it's almost like the change in language is designed to trip people up, because I think a lot of people, very few of us have kind of major problems in our lives now. I think we look for problems, and actually you can create problems by changing the language, tripping people up. It gives you the moral high ground if you can come in and say, oh, by the way, you shouldn't say that because of this made up reason. A lot of people like that. It's
creating a challenge where there is none. And that's not to say there is no challenges in modern life. We've got a cost of living crisis. We've had a pandemic. We've had lockdowns. We've had, you might be getting close to climate anxiety, Mike, which is a big one, isn't it? But there is some level of strife, but it is a position of comfort and abundance, seeking out challenge and offense where it wasn't previously, and like almost new problems that we've created from a position where we actually don't have really genuine ones. So instead we'll decide that that word is really offensive. And again, one of the ones that I told you about privately, and I'm happy to share, was lunatic. And I had a piece of artwork that was installed in a project that it was a traditional map from the 1800s of the city that I was installing for the project. And the map had a lunatic asylum on it. And I was asked politely enough by my client, they were coming with their best intentions, to remove the term lunatic because that could be deemed offensive by the residents and the people that use that space. And I was thinking, but that's what that building was called at that period of time. And it wasn't deemed, it might have derogatory connotations, lunatic, a crazy person, but at the time that word wasn't designed to, or maybe it was designed to show it was different, but it wasn't a slur. You weren't like shouting like that's the lunatic asylum. Like that was just what it was called, in the same way that a building previously might have been called the mill or the workhouse. Like that, like they're maybe not terms that we use nowadays, but for it to be wiped from history and erased from our past, that's one of the things that always concerns me, and it gives me kind of 1984 vibes.
Yeah, I'd very much agree with that. And what's interesting on that topic is that we're trying to erase some words like that no one really finds offensive, like lunatic. I'm sure there are others as well.
Guys.
Yeah. But at the same time, we're trying to kind of reuse words that actually are quite offensive. So the number of people I hear say about an ex-partner, they're a narcissist. You think, but were they a narcissist, or were they just, not the nicest person? Or the ever-expanding definition of racist or fascist. And the danger with that is that if you use it on everyone you don't like, how do you then identify the real racists or fascists? Because there are definitely real racists and fascists out there, and they're quite dangerous people, and we should be aware of them. But if anyone who you don't agree with, who maybe thinks, oh yeah, perhaps we should have some guidelines on immigration, and you go, oh, you're just a racist. It's like, so on the one hand, we're getting rid of some words that could be deemed offensive, whilst massively
others have lost their
others.
weight. They've really lost their weight. I think terms like Nazi have completely lost their weight. Anyone that was deemed right of centre was getting called a Nazi or a fascist during different elections. And I'm thinking, that's definitely not a National Socialist. That's definitely not somebody that's fascist. If they're part of the political system, albeit Hitler did adhere to political system up to a point until he was able to seize power, they're probably not a member of a fascist party or have fascist ideology at their heart.
No, and it's just, I think probably a lot of it is projection from people, in terms of, we all know that when you're angry or annoyed, you'll do the whole like hate scrolling on your phone, as in what can I find to annoy me? I think some people take that a step further of throwing the accusations. But for me, it always comes back to, again, words can and should have power, but it works in both ways, in terms of they are just words at the end of the day, and you might not like them, but you have the option to remove yourself from that conversation. Yet at the same time, we need to make sure they do keep their meaning, keep their power, because, like I said, otherwise, how do you recognize the true Nazis, fascists, whatever you're talking about? Because we've done a lot of work, more so than in any other time in history, over the last probably 40 to 50 years, to have a society that certainly in the West is more tolerant than ever, is more inclusive than ever, has fewer boundaries for anyone than ever. And I almost feel like, without being hyperbolic, there's a danger that could go back slightly with how language is being used and how everything's being policed. So I'm not going to come in here and say it's a catastrophe and everything's kind of reversed, but you could also see it going that way with the polarization and division.
Yeah, there is a definite risk. And I think you're right when you raise that it goes both ways, side to side, because people create outrage on either side of the... I don't know if it's really a spectrum, as you say, because J.K. Rowling's one of the people that's come under heavy attack for speaking about women's rights in respect to like women's only spaces for changing bathrooms, etc. And she was called a TERF, and I'd never heard that term before. I don't mix in a circle that would use a word like that, but for that word to then, that word which was on particular banners that some politicians were standing near, not in front of, I don't think, and at protests, and then people were sending it online to her that subsequently were charged with certain things. I don't think that word needs banned, but what does it stand for again?
Trans exclusionary radical feminist.
Okay, so it's a new word, it's made up, but that I don't think that needs banned. Like people shouting, "Oh, you're a TERF!" Like it doesn't. I don't think it offends. It's when you say "kill all TERFs" that becomes a problem, because that's inciting violence that we spoke about before as well. But I find it funny that people who are quite pro freedom of speech and maybe defending Rowling's ability to say that women's spaces for women, which doesn't seem a particularly extreme standpoint when you look into some of the things that she was saying beyond that, her being called a TERF shouldn't be a problem. Like you shouldn't shut that down. You can say it's incorrect in the same way that if somebody said, "Oh, that's Rishi Sunak's a fascist," it's ludicrous. Like he's not a fascist. It just loses weight when people get really upset that particular word's been used. But equally, people who are like complaining about Sunak being called a fascist or somebody being called a Nazi, they should then not also get upset when somebody calls J.K. Rowling a particular term that they think's inaccurate too, but they shouldn't cancel that word or term.
No, I would agree with that. And I think that's where you see what people truly believe, because as we can probably say, it's been more one side of the political aisle that's been pro freedom of speech than the other for the last, probably since I've got into online stuff, really the last 5 to 10 years. And that's accelerated more the last couple of years, but you will still see, as you say, people come out who are very pro freedom of speech and say, well, I don't think you should say that because of so-and-so. Which is not to say that they don't have merit in their argument. They might make a very good case for that, but I kind of think it weakens your argument as well. It's one of those things where there's always caveats, but I think a lot of people will say, I'm for freedom of speech, but, and it's what comes after that. And if that but is something like, but there is such a thing as being libelous and there is such a thing as incitement to violence, I think that's a perfectly acceptable but. If it's anything else, I slightly worry about...
They tie themselves in caveats and you're just like, oh, well, you are being a hypocrite here.
Yeah.
Because I can say what I like, but if the other side say something about me, that's not on.
Yeah. So you have to be willing to, sort of die. Well, that has to be the hill that you die on, really. I think in terms of actually if people come after you online, you just got to go with it, unfortunately. And again, that's why all this stuff is worse online, I think. And that's why I don't ever tie myself up too much in what people online say, because it is always exacerbated over how they be in real life. And I mean, I think it's sad how much division there is as well. You look at the hatred online of people who don't even know each other, and even people who've got quite high profiles that we were talking about the other day, how bitter and miserable some people seem. You think, you should probably just put the phone down and kind of have fun instead.
Step away from it, because you're consumed by it. No, I mean, I think we finished the last podcast on a note where we hope that freedom of speech would continue to be protected, and I don't think it's radically moved, albeit I think there's certain words that have now been struck off again, and I've experienced silly things in the corporate world, like the removing of lunatic from our lexicon and from our history apparently as well, guys and things like that as well. But I think the more people have like rational conversations where it's talked about, and the more normal people maybe open their mouths to say, oh well, I don't really feel like I have to use that particular term because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't grammatically make sense quite often as well. But no, I think I'm relatively optimistic. I think Konstantin Kissin's speech at Oxford was a good way of conveying the benefits of, I don't want to say anti-wokeism, but a more reasoned take than some of the crazy stuff that we've seen.
I think the one thing that potentially worries me is this online safety bill, online harms bill they want to put through. Which has been a policy that apparently has been kind of on the sidelines for quite a while, and they're trying to push it through now that they are talking about, there's a lot of thrown around the term of hate speech, and again, like a lot of things, it's dressed up as the online safety bill, so it's for your own safety, for your own good. And having read into some of it, I'd be quite worried if that came through. Again, it's only online, but as we know, online is kind of the public square now, It's how a lot of people communicate. It's a primary form of communication, has a lot of influence over elections and how countries are run. And I say that as someone who's not a party political person at all, but it still shapes our society. And I do worry that that's going to be something that potentially has very negative ramifications. And to the extent that, again, not being a party political person, but I emailed my local MP about it, who is part of the Conservative Party, and he told me that, oh no, this is going to protect freedom of speech. And when I asked him why censoring speech was going to protect it and enhance it, well, I didn't hear back. Not that I expected to hear back, but it's one of those things.
It's too hard a question, Mike.
Obviously, but I just think
Beyond his pay grade.
Yeah, it's just, you get the party line, don't you? And you think, is that what you believe, or is it what you're being told to do? And is there potentially an agenda behind this? And I like to say I'm quite a rational person who doesn't go down, well, no, I do go down rabbit holes, but I'm not sucked into conspiracy theories. But yeah, you do wonder who's potentially pushing that, really, because it does seem potentially quite dangerous.
Yeah, no, I think there's certain things that I just detach myself now from politically massively. I don't watch a lot of the news, but when legislation comes in that does radically affect what you're allowed to say in person and online, and we have a bill in Scotland which allows criminalisation within your own home as well, which is a really invasive piece of legislation that I would certainly not be in favour of, and it is very 1984. Like, you shouldn't speak against the party. Not that I'm saying it's speaking, you necessarily get prosecuted for speaking against the SNP, but it's just a general concept that I disagree with. So that's when equally I'm a big fan of, like, switch off from the news, don't worry too much about politics, like let them do their own thing. Like, I'll vote in elections when I feel compelled to, and I typically have done. But when something as big as that comes in, it is something you probably need to be aware of.
Oh, without a doubt. And I was the same before COVID stuff. I had probably not watched the news for about 8 or 9 years, I think, because I'd made that decision not to. I think it was actually, might have been a Tim Ferriss podcast with, I want to say it was Alain de Botton he was talking to. And yeah, they mentioned about not watching the news. And I thought, actually, that seems like a smart idea. So I'd switched off from it. And then I think during COVID, it was wise to watch it to know kind of what was going on, really. Not in terms of, oh, this week you can have a Scotch egg in the pub, and next week actually you need to have a sandwich or whatever, or, oh, we're reducing the gap from 2 meters to 1.5 meters and whatever. But for the sort of to be able to see the hypocrisy of it, I think, and actually the kind of things I just said really weren't that far from a lot of what was being said. So for me, I started watching a lot more there, not to know what I was supposed to do and what I was supposed to not do, but more to be able to go and look at it and think, does this make sense? And obviously you go online to look at the counter narrative, but that sort of sucked me back into it. But yeah, for the most part, I think have an awareness of what's going on, because I think if you don't, it's just a degree of naivety.
Ignorance isn't actually bliss.
No, I think, well, we spoke about it the other night that for some people it probably is, but for me, I can live my life with that much ignorance over what was going on. Most of the time I don't bother with it, but I think you need to have an awareness so you know when there's some mission creep and when there's some things that you probably should get frustrated about. And I'm very much, for the most part, out of sight, out of mind. Like, again, if there's something going on in the world and it doesn't interest me, I'm probably not going to have an opinion on it, because I don't want to have an opinion when I've not researched it. And some people would say, that's very naive, you should be more in touch with world affairs. But I just think, well, we've all got a certain amount of bandwidth. Yeah, time and energy. Got it. Yeah. But then for other stuff that could affect you, I think, yeah, research it.
Tune in, speak to your friends about it, speak to your family about it, and try and have rational conversations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, Mike, well, let's take that home. I've really enjoyed the chance to speak to you in the studio. If people want to continue the conversation with you, where should they head towards?
Best place, I do most stuff on Instagram these days. So is the Coffee Shop Copywriter, all one word. And then if people have got questions, I'm always happy to answer. So just pop me a message.
Brilliant. That'll be linked in the show notes. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to you, the listener. And I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.